Ash and Catriona, one a shadowed insider, the other a fearless journalist, were the unlikely forces that shattered the iron grip of a ruthless gang ruling Scotland's forgotten town. Their courage sparked a battle that exposed corruption, silenced fear, and proved that even the darkest empires can fall. This is their story. Ironvale was the kind of place most people passed by without a second thought. Tucked away in the northern highlands of Scotland, it had once been a proud industrial town, filled with coal miners, steel workers, and tight-knit families. But as the industries dried up and jobs vanished, so did hope. Buildings crumbled, businesses closed their doors, and the streets emptied. Nature began to reclaim the edges of the town. Ivy crept up the sides of boarded windows, rust coated the old rail tracks, and the wind carried an eerie silence that never quite felt natural. It wasn't just abandonment, it felt like the town had been swallowed by something darker. Locals stopped talking to outsiders. They kept their heads down and moved quickly. Questions were dangerous. People knew something was wrong, but fear kept them quiet. Police rarely patrolled anymore. When they did, they didn't stay long. Even emergency services began to delay responses to calls from Ironvale. Ambulances arrived late, if at all. Fires burned unchecked for just a little too long. And the people, what few were left, lived in the kind of stillness that only comes from being watched. Crime didn't creep into Ironvale. It stormed in and took over. The shift was subtle at first. Young men in new cars that didn't match their day jobs. Unfamiliar faces standing at corners for hours. The sudden rise in missing persons reports. Then came the open drug dealing, the arson, the quiet funerals with no questions asked. The town's decay was no longer just economic. It was violent, calculated, and deeply organized. Those who had the means left. Those who stayed behind did so because they had no other choice. Rumors began to circulate about a group known only as the Eight. No one seemed to know exactly who they were, but their presence was everywhere. Every act of violence, every threat, every bribe carried their invisible stamp. They didn't need to show their faces. They made their power known through whispers, warnings, and the chilling realization that nothing in Ironvale happened without their approval. Attempts to resist were short-lived. Shopkeepers who refused to pay protection money found their businesses burned to the ground. A schoolteacher who reported a student's bruises was found unconscious outside the playground. No one could prove who did it. Everyone knew anyway. Ironvale didn't just fall, it was taken. And once it was, the rules changed. It became a place where justice no longer mattered, where silence was survival, and where power lived in the shadows. No one saw the exact moment the Eight took control. There was no single day when the town shifted. Instead, it was like a slow poison, silent, steady, and irreversible. At first, they operated in the background, invisible to most. An odd favor here, a quiet threat there. But with every small act, their grip on Ironvale tightened. They didn't need recognition. Power was more useful when it was unseen. Locals began to notice patterns, even if they didn't speak about them. A man caught stealing vanished without police involvement. A debt collector known for his violence suddenly disappeared, and no one dared ask why. People who were once vocal about the town's decline either left without warning or stopped speaking altogether. It became clear that someone, or something, was orchestrating the silence, and that realization spread through Ironvale faster than the cold Highland wind. The name The Eight began appearing in hushed conversations, usually behind locked doors or whispered over the phone. The group was said to be made up of 8 individuals, each responsible for a key part of Ironvale's descent. One ran the drugs, another controlled the weapons, a third managed the money, cleaning it through fake charities and shell businesses. The others handled enforcement, surveillance, police contacts, prison networks, and political favors. Together, they were untouchable. Or at least that's how it felt. No one had ever seen all 8 members together. Most didn't even know what any of them looked like. They used others to do their dirty work, layers upon layers of people who answered to someone slightly more powerful than themselves. This structure made it nearly impossible to trace any order back to its source. Even when people were arrested, they rarely talked. And if they did, they didn't live long enough to say much. The 8 weren't driven by chaos. They built a system, a brutal, efficient machine that kept Ironvale under their control. They paid well, punished quickly, and operated with a disturbing sense of discipline. Loyalty wasn't requested, it was demanded, and those who gave it were rewarded with protection, money, and power. Those who didn't were erased, not just physically but socially. Their names were removed from records. Their families were pressured into silence. It was as though they had never existed at all. Over time, the town adapted. People learned how to avoid attention, how to keep secrets, how to survive. It wasn't just fear that held Ironvale in place, it was resignation. The 8 were no longer just a gang, they were a fact of life. Inside Ironvale, fear wasn't loud, it was quiet, heavy, and constant. The streets looked ordinary during the day, almost peaceful. Children still played, shops still opened, and buses still ran. But beneath that surface, everything was tightly controlled. Nothing happened without someone watching. And if something happened that wasn't meant to, it didn't happen again. The 8 had embedded themselves deep within the town's most trusted systems. It started with a few bribes to underpaid officers. Then came favors. Overlooked evidence, skipped patrols, delayed reports. Within a few years, the police in Ironvale weren't just ineffective, they were compromised. Certain officers had direct lines to gang enforcers. Others simply looked the other way, preferring to stay ignorant rather than end up on a list. It didn't stop there. The 8 extended their influence into healthcare. Paramedics were told not to ask about stab wounds. Doctors signed off on false death certificates. Files went missing from hospital records, erased or rewritten to cover up the truth. Even teachers began receiving warnings when bruises or injuries were noticed on children. Questions had to stop at concern. Reporting those things led to closed schools, targeted vandalism, or worse. One social worker vanished after refusing to drop a case. Her body was never found. The local council, already struggling from years of economic decline, was no match for what came next. Funding for community programs disappeared. Building permits were mysteriously granted for suspicious properties. Charity groups run by the 8 were praised in public, but used to clean dirty money in private. The town's budget was quietly redirected to the gang's front organizations. No one could explain the missing funds, and no one dared to try. Ironvale's prison system played its own role in maintaining the gang's dominance. Members who were caught and convicted often served only a fraction of their sentences. Guards were paid off. Records were tampered with. Some inmates left through the front doors under fake names and never returned. Meanwhile, rival dealers or informants found themselves transferred to violent cell blocks or found dead in solitary. What kept the 8 so powerful wasn't just the violence, it was the control. People were trapped in a world where the rules didn't apply to the powerful. Justice was a word that had lost all meaning. The law wasn't broken in Ironvale, it was rewritten. Slowly, the town became a place where truth had no weight, and silence was safer than hope. The people who once believed in justice now believed in survival. And that was exactly how the 8 wanted it. Catriona Bell arrived in Ironvale with nothing more than a rented car, a camera, and a stubborn sense of purpose. At 28, she had already made a name for herself by exposing corruption in places no one else wanted to look. She had a reputation for being fearless, sometimes reckless, but always determined. When whispers of a town ruled by a faceless gang reached her desk in Inverness, she packed her things without hesitation. Something about Ironvale didn't sit right with her. The silence felt unnatural. She spent weeks walking the streets, talking to residents, collecting stories in pieces. Most were too afraid to speak on record. Some would only talk through closed doors or anonymous messages. But what she found was consistent. a network of fear and control that stretched far deeper than she expected. She began connecting the dots. Closed businesses linked to the same address, local officials suddenly wealthy, families who had lost members without ever receiving an investigation. The Eight weren't just a gang. They were an invisible government running the town from the shadows. The Town That Doesn't Sleep was uploaded in the early hours of a Tuesday morning. Within hours, it spread across Scotland. Readers were stunned. A modern town completely overtaken by organized crime? With no intervention? It was unthinkable. News outlets picked it up. Television crews started making their way to Ironvale. The government made statements promising to look into the allegations. For the first time in years, light was being shown into the darkest corners of the town. But Catriona never got to see the full impact of her work. Just 3 days after publishing the article, she disappeared. Her rental car was found abandoned on a narrow country road just outside of Ironvale. Her laptop, bag, and camera were missing. Her phone had been turned off the night before and never turned back on. The police opened an investigation, but it was sluggish from the start. Evidence went missing, witnesses retracted statements, tips dried up. Locals said nothing. It was as if the ground had swallowed her whole. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through the media and the public. What had started as outrage over a corrupt town quickly turned into something more personal. People wanted answers. Vigils were held. Protests began to form. Activist groups demanded an independent inquiry. What was once fear turned into fury. Catriona's story had opened the floodgates, but her silence lit the fire. For the first time, the country was watching Ironvale, and the Eight were being seen. The disappearance of Catriona Bell changed everything. What had once been whispers in the dark became front-page headlines. Her face was everywhere, on news broadcasts, social media feeds, and pinned to protest banners. She had become more than a journalist. She was a symbol of truth silenced too soon. And people were angry. In Edinburgh, members of Parliament demanded answers. In Inverness, fellow journalists gathered to demand accountability. Public pressure mounted quickly, and it became clear that the usual empty promises wouldn't satisfy the crowd this time. The government announced the creation of a special task force assigned to investigate the claims in Catriona's exposé and to find out what had happened to her. For the first time in years, Ironvale was no longer ignored. The arrival of the task force marked the beginning of the town's wreck. They didn't rely on the local police, most of whom were already suspected of being compromised. Instead, a separate team of investigators, cybercrime experts, and undercover agents began working quietly, gathering evidence. They studied Catriona's notes, traced financial transactions, and followed up on the names she had mentioned in her final article. The more they uncovered, the more disturbing the truth became. The Eight weren't just manipulating the town, they were embedded in regional power structures. One member had influence in the local council. Another had been funding political campaigns across Scotland. Surveillance footage revealed secret meetings in remote hotels. Bribes were traced through layers of fake companies, many operating under the cover of community outreach programs. Even retired law enforcement officers were found to be involved, having taken pensions and hush money in exchange for silence. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that Catriona had been right. Ironvale hadn't simply decayed, it had been methodically hollowed out from within. The Eight had used fear as their weapon, but corruption was their foundation. What surprised investigators most wasn't just the scale of the operation, but how long it had gone undetected. It wasn't just a gang, it was a system, carefully maintained over a decade. Key files had been deleted or altered. Surveillance equipment had been destroyed. Even some of the town's crime statistics had been falsified to avoid attention. Still, despite the danger, more people began to speak. Protected by outside authorities, former victims and witnesses started coming forward. The silence that had once strangled Ironvale began to lift, and with each new testimony, the Eight's fortress of secrecy weakened. What they didn't anticipate was that the outrage stirred by one missing journalist would grow into a movement too big to stop. 2 months after the investigation into Ironvale began, a man walked into the Inverness police station and quietly changed everything. He didn't give a full name, just called himself Ash. He wore a heavy coat, a cap pulled low, and carried a folder thick with documents. He didn't ask for a lawyer or witness protection. All he wanted was to talk to the people leading the Ironvale case. When they sat down with him, what he revealed stunned the entire task force. Ash claimed to be a former enforcer for the Eight, one of the original members who had been with the gang since the beginning. His position had placed him close to the core, allowing him to observe nearly every decision the gang made. He wasn't just a foot soldier. He was trusted, and for years he had helped maintain the gang's grip on Ironvale. But something had changed. He said he had grown tired of the lies, the deaths, and the rot. More than that, he said. The Eight had betrayed him. He had been promised protection, a clean break, and a new identity. Instead, they left him vulnerable when he tried to walk away. He wanted revenge, and the only weapon he had left was the truth. Ash's information was explosive. He provided names, locations, internal codes, and photographs. He pointed investigators to storage units full of stolen goods, properties used for trafficking, and secret meeting spots used by the Eight to plan operations. He even described a hidden room in a community center where financial records had been kept. Records showing how the gang laundered money through fake construction projects and front charities. Every detail he gave checked out. One by one, his claims were confirmed by surveillance footage, intercepted calls, and newly recovered documents. Even more valuable than the evidence was the structure he laid bare. Ash mapped out the full hierarchy of the Eight's empire, from the top bosses to the street-level dealers. He explained how orders were passed through layers of intermediaries, how messages were coded, and how enforcement squads were deployed to silence threats. With his help, investigators began connecting previously isolated cases, linking disappearances and unsolved crimes directly back to the gang. But Ash's involvement came with risks. Once word leaked that someone had turned informant, the Eight began to panic. Known associates were moved or disappeared entirely. 2 safe houses burned down within a week. Members of the task force received anonymous threats. It became clear that the gang was preparing for something, either a final stand or a desperate escape. Still, Ash didn't flinch. He knew the risk, but after years of fear and silence, he had finally decided to break the code. He wasn't seeking redemption, he just wanted to destroy the empire he helped build. And with every secret he exposed, that empire started to fall. Ash's revelations turned the investigation into a full-scale operation. What had begun as a probe into a missing journalist was now a coordinated national takedown effort. The Eight had spent years hiding behind layers of loyalty and corruption, but Ash had ripped the mask off. His detailed knowledge gave investigators something they'd never had before: clarity. The web of Ironvale's criminal empire was no longer invisible. It was mapped, named, and understood. Surveillance units were deployed across Scotland. Unmarked vans sat quietly outside warehouses and back alleys that Ash had flagged. Undercover officers infiltrated businesses thought to be laundering operations. Wiretaps were placed on phones linked to suspected insiders. The information gathered confirmed what many feared. The Eight's control stretched well beyond Ironvale. They had influence in Glasgow, ties to international smuggling routes through ports in Aberdeen, and even deals with foreign crime groups who provided weapons and forged documents. Points of the most alarming discoveries came from a storage facility outside Dundee. Hidden behind a false wall, investigators found boxes of weapons, firearms, explosives, even military-grade gear, stored with precise labels and serial numbers. Next to them were stacks of documents, financial ledgers, fake IDs, and blueprints for expanding operations into new towns. The gang had not been content with Ironvale. They had planned to spread their control across Scotland. Every new piece of evidence pointed to a terrifying level of organization. This wasn't a chaotic gang of thugs. It was a criminal syndicate with long-term strategies, backup plans, and embedded insiders in government and law enforcement. A former accountant who had worked under duress for one of the Eight's shell charities came forward, revealing how millions had been funneled through fake community projects, including youth outreach programs and building renovations that never happened. The money had gone straight back to the gang. As these revelations made their way to the task force's central office, prosecutors began drafting dozens of indictments. Arrest warrants were prepared. International partners were alerted. But the investigators knew they had to act quickly. The Eight had already started to react. Phones went dead. Locations were vacated. Digital trails were wiped. They were tightening their circle. Despite the chaos, Ash remained steady. He worked closely with a small, secure team, providing updates, warning of possible retaliation, and identifying safe places for raids. His inside knowledge allowed the task force to move faster than the gang expected. Ironvale was no longer the hidden empire it once was. Its web was unraveling, one thread at a time. For the first time, the Eight were on the back foot, and for the first time, Ironvale had the upper hand. The night of the raids arrived with a chill that matched the tension gripping Ironvale. Under the cover of darkness, police vehicles and military trucks rolled quietly into town. Helicopters hovered low over the hills, their spotlights slicing through the fog. This was the largest coordinated operation Scotland had ever seen against an organized crime group. Months of careful planning, intelligence gathering, and patience had led to this moment. Teams moved swiftly and silently. Some officers stormed known safe houses where weapons and drugs were stored, while others surrounded homes linked to the Eight's leadership. At the same time, units searched banks, offices, and front businesses where money laundering took place. The operation was designed to catch the gang off guard, to overwhelm them before they could react. By dawn, 6 members of the Eight were in custody. Each arrest was a significant blow. These were not low-level criminals, but the heart of the organization. Their faces, once hidden behind shadows and rumors, were now on every news broadcast. The town was shocked, but the real surprise came with the discovery of one member's body in a rented apartment. Poison had been the cause. An execution sent as a grim warning to anyone who might think of betrayal. The leader of the Eight, however, was nowhere to be found. Investigators found signs he had fled moments before the raid. His bunker, a hidden underground room beneath a derelict warehouse, contained files and digital records showing plans for a new identity and escape route out of the country. Authorities feared he might still be out there, free and dangerous. Despite the leader's escape, the raids marked a turning point. The empire that had ruled Ironvale for years was crumbling. Seized assets included millions of pounds in cash, luxury cars, and weapons caches. Important documents and computers were taken for forensic analysis, revealing more connections and transactions. The arrest sent a clear message: the era of impunity was over. As the town awoke to the news, relief mixed with cautious optimism. People began to emerge from their homes, some crying, some cheering quietly. But beneath the celebration was a lingering fear. The Eight might be broken, but the wounds they left were deep. Families torn apart, communities silenced, trust shattered. Law enforcement doubled down on protection efforts, aware that remnants of the gang could strike back. Surveillance increased, and support services for victims were expanded. The fight was far from over. Ironvale had faced its darkest night, and survived. The power that had once been untouchable was now exposed and weakened. Though one man had slipped through the cracks, the rest of the Eight were behind bars. For the first time in years, the town could begin to imagine a future without fear. After the raids, the legal battle to bring the Eight to justice began in earnest. The courtroom became a new battleground where years of silence, money laundering, assault, and conspiracy to commit murder. Sentences ranged from lengthy prison terms to life sentences without parole. The court's decision sent a powerful message that no one was above the law. Yet, the trial also exposed the complexity of healing a community torn apart. While justice was served, rebuilding trust and safety would take years. Many families still lived in fear, wary of possible retaliation from remnants of the gang or their sympathizers. The story of the 8 was no longer just about crime, it was about resilience. Ironvale had faced unimaginable darkness and, through courage and perseverance, begun the slow journey back to the light. The trial was a reminder that truth, though often delayed, could never be permanently silenced. It was a hard-won victory, not just for the law, but for the people who refused to be broken, accepting bribes. Prison guards described orchestrated attacks on rival inmates. The courtroom became a place where the town's darkest secrets were forced into the light. The defense tried to paint Ash as unreliable, a vengeful traitor motivated by personal gain. But the overwhelming evidence and the testimonies of other victims made this impossible to maintain. Slowly, the jury began to see the truth behind the carefully constructed lies. Months passed, and the trial became a symbol of hope and justice for many in Ironvale and beyond. The public followed every development closely, hungry for accountability. News coverage was intense, and support groups formed to help those affected by the gang's violence and intimidation. In the end, the verdict was clear. All 6 members on trial were found guilty on multiple counts. Racketeering, drug trafficking, fear, and corruption were challenged head-on. Prosecutors prepared meticulously, knowing that every detail mattered. The evidence collected was overwhelming, but the 8's defense teams were equally determined, using every legal tactic to delay proceedings and sow doubt. Witnesses faced enormous pressure. Some recanted their statements, too scared to testify openly. Others turned up with new information that shocked the court, revealing betrayals even within the gang itself. Ash, the insider who had helped investigators from the start, agreed to testify under heavy protection. His presence was a turning point, lending credibility to the prosecution's case and providing a rare glimpse inside the gang's operations. As the trial unfolded, stories emerged about how deeply the 8 had penetrated Ironvale's institutions. Former police officers confessed to covering up crimes. Council members admitted, with the 8 dismantled and their leaders behind bars, Ironvale began the long, difficult process of healing. The scars left by years of fear and control were deep, and the town knew recovery wouldn't happen overnight. But something had shifted. Hope had returned. The silence that had once smothered the community was now replaced by conversations about change, accountability, and rebuilding. Local leaders, with new faces and renewed commitment, launched programs aimed at restoring trust. Funding was directed toward mental health services, youth outreach, and support for families affected by the gang's violence. Schools reopened with a focus on safety and inclusion, and community centers became places for gathering rather than hiding. People who had once kept their distance started to come together, sharing stories and dreams for a future free from the shadow of the 8. Journalists returned, but this time with a different role, not just exposing crime, but telling stories of resilience and progress. Memorials were held for those lost or forever changed by the gang's reign. Catriona Bell, whose courage had sparked the fight, was remembered not only as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. Her name was added to a plaque in the town square, a symbol of bravery and the relentless pursuit of truth. Law enforcement also worked to regain the community's trust. Officers who had been complicit were removed, replaced by new recruits trained in transparency and respect. Independent oversight committees were established to monitor policing and ensure corruption could never take root again. The message was clear. Ironvale would never again be a place where criminals ruled. Even as progress was made, challenges remained. Some residents struggled with trauma, economic hardship, and the legacy of mistrust. But the community's spirit, once buried beneath fear, began to shine. Local businesses reopened, festivals returned, and laughter echoed once more through the streets. Ironvale's story became a powerful example of what can happen when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice. It showed how one voice, like Catriona's, could ignite a movement, how the courage of a single insider, like Ash, could turn the tide, and how relentless determination could break even the most entrenched power. The town's transformation wasn't complete, but it was underway. The days of silence and fear were over. Ironvale had fought back against darkness and won. The legacy of the Eight became a warning, a lesson, and a call to vigilance.